George Augustus Frederick was born on August 12, 1762, the first son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. From birth, he was marked by the promise of greatness, destined to be a star in British royalty. Intelligent, charming, and with striking features, George was the prince everyone admired. His youth was marked by an aura of magnetism and a captivating personality that made him the darling of high society. The elegance of his clothing, his refined manners, and his sharp mind made him the centerpiece of noble parties and events. His early brilliance was not limited to appearance. His intelligence was noticed from a young age, making him a natural leader. Unlike many of his contemporaries, George knew how to use his presence to win hearts and minds. In many ways, he was the ideal prince, embodying the British dream of a strong and prosperous monarchy. But, as often happens with great promises, the shadows of a dark fate were already being cast upon him. The British court, which always expected royal family members to follow a strict line of discipline and morality, treated George as a bold young man full of potential. Yet, the pressure to conform to a life of restriction and duty began to weigh heavily on the young prince. George grew up in a palace where his father's strict morality made life extremely restrictive, almost unbearable. And it was in this stifling environment that the seeds of decadence began to sprout. As George sought ways to escape the constant surveillance and royal expectations, it was at the age of 21, when he moved to Carlton House in London, that George's true transformation began. Free from the constraints of paternal oversight, the prince threw himself into a life of excess. The opulence of Carlton House and the freedom he now enjoyed allowed him to pursue pleasure without restraint. This led him to stray from his royal responsibilities, starting his journey of self-destruction. But at that moment, the world still saw him as the charming prince, someone with everything to achieve, both in power and in respect. The monarch he would one day become, revered for his greatness, was still far from the figure the world would see in the future, monstrous decaying figure, consumed by his own power and pleasure. With the beginning of his independent life, George IV plunged into the abyss of indulgence. Instead of controlling his passions, he embraced them with fervor, turning his life into a spectacle of excess. What once seemed to be a prince dedicated to greater causes quickly became a man consumed by instant pleasure. Drinks, parties, and banquets became part of his daily routine, and he never hesitated to indulge in the pleasures of life. He enjoyed feasts where food was consumed in grotesque quantities, while servants watched in horror as the dishes were prepared in enough quantity to feed an entire city. Food was not just a physical necessity for George, but an act of opulence and a demonstration of his own grandeur. On one occasion, his breakfast included 2 pigeons, 3 beefsteaks, most of a bottle of white wine, champagne, port, and brandy. And this was only the beginning. The day would go on with lunches and dinners that resembled Roman feasts more than civilized dining. George did not know what moderation was, and his spending on food was just a reflection of his philosophy of life. Spend without stopping, drink without ceasing, and consume without concern. But these excesses came with a price. As the prince grew fatter, his debts also grew at a frightening rate. By the 1790s, George's debts reached staggering numbers, and the financial situation was out of control. With each bailout from Parliament, he sank further into debt, spending on clothing, palaces, art, and luxury entertainments. It was as if nothing was enough to fill the void George felt in his life. His friends and allies began to fear that the monarch was heading toward a complete collapse, yet he continued, unchecked, in his spiral of decadence. In addition to his food excesses, George also became involved in love scandals ranging from scandalous lovers to tumultuous marriages. His relationship with the Catholic widow Maria Fitzherbert was the first of many scandals. The prince married her illegally in 1785, which caused a constitutional crisis. However, the relationship wouldn't last, and in 1795 he would marry Princess Caroline of Brunswick, in a marriage that would become one of the biggest disasters in royal history. With George IV's rise to the title of Prince Regent in 1810, when his father, George III, was declared unfit to rule, the prince gained access to absolute power. During the 10 years of the regency, he threw himself into his indulgent lifestyle with even more intensity. Without the burden of royal responsibility, George was able to focus even more on the personal pleasures that had become his sole priority. He made excessive use of his authority, commanding grandiose projects, spending huge sums of public money on extravagant architectural works and parties that placed him further into debt. Although he was a charismatic leader, his tenure as Prince Regent was disastrous. He had a shallow understanding of state affairs, making him vulnerable to political manipulation. His interference in political matters caused chaos in the government, frustrating ministers and parliamentarians. His obsession with luxury and entertainment prevented him from understanding the real needs of the country. His financial bailouts and the creation of a monarchy focused more on grandeur than on stability, only heightened tensions. George surrounded himself with a network of people who adored him due to his generosity with the arts and the parties he hosted, but many feared his lack of control. The king, who saw himself as the center of power and wealth, would soon become one of the most unpopular monarchs of his time, completely disconnected from the needs of the people and the duties of the throne. His relationship with politics and the British rulers was increasingly marked by disrespect and incoherence. George IV's excesses were not limited to entertainment and politics. His dependence on substances like laudanum, a liquid opiate, became well known among those who surrounded him. His mind, already weakened by the abuses, grew increasingly clouded. He consumed such high doses of drugs before public appearances that his condition was visible to all. The public facade of George was that of a monarch, but the truth behind the palace was of a man incapable of dealing with his own demons, increasingly lost in a spiral of vices and frivolities. As power and excess continued to erode George IV's life, his decadence became more and more visible to those around him. The fame of his feasts and wild parties spread throughout Europe, but what few knew was the cost he was paying for this life of indulgence. Slowly, the machinery of the monarch, who once believed himself invincible, began to falter. His health deteriorated at an alarming rate, yet he continued to indulge in the same vices that had driven him to the bottom. By 1797, George weighed about 245 pounds, a staggering amount for the time. The obesity that began to settle in his body affected his daily functions, making even the simplest movements a painful task. His vanity, however, did not diminish. In an attempt to hide the extent of his decaying body, George employed tailors, wig makers, corset makers, and makeup artists to try to conceal his increasingly grotesque appearance. His obsession with external image, the need to appear impeccable to the public, was, in many ways, a reflection of his inability to accept the reality of his ruined body. But it wasn't just the physical aspects of his life that were in ruins. George was trapped in a web of family and political scandals that, no matter how much he tried to hide, could not be ignored. His separation from his wife Caroline in 1796 and the constant public feuds became the center of attention in the newspapers and society. He did everything to mistreat and humiliate her publicly, but what he didn't realize was that his own figure would become a spectacle of horror, turning into a burden for those around him. His dependence on alcohol and drugs intensified over the years, and the situation reached a point where he could no longer perform his duties as monarch. In 1820, after his father's death, George was finally crowned king, but this was a hollow victory. He had already been so consumed by his vices that what should have been a moment of pride became just another event of excess and humiliation. His imminent death, already evident to all, seemed more like a release for the crown than a time for mourning. When George IV finally ascended to the throne in 1820, the scene was entirely different from what one would expect of a king. He was already completely consumed by his vices, and the monarchy that should represent dignity and stability became nothing more than a facade. His health was in complete collapse, and he was now seen as a shadow of the monarch he could have been. Instead of ruling with authority, George became a mere spectator of his own reign, incapable of fulfilling even the most basic duties of the office. George's body, which had become immense and sick from excess, no longer matched his position. His legs swelled with fluid, and he struggled even to walk. Servants were forced to carry him as if he were a piece of furniture, a ghost of a king who was once great. His vacant gaze and erratic behavior did not go unnoticed, especially during his public appearances, where his weakened condition was visible to all. His speeches were incoherent, and he sank into a state of near unconsciousness, still dependent on drugs to endure his few interactions with the outside world. This total loss of control over his health and life was an expression of what George IV's reign had become, a representation of failure. Instead of being the pillar of strength the British expected, he had become a monarch incapable of commanding, a king unable to control his own existence. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone. The man who should have been a figure of authority for the nation was, in reality, a burden to the crown itself. His loss of control was not just physical, but mental as well. Paranoia and emotional instability began to dominate George. His outbursts of anger were followed by periods of deep depression. He isolated himself more and more, surrounded only by those who, out of obligation, were at his service. His decay was no longer just a reflection of the body. It was a total failure of his ability to govern and even to live with dignity. When George IV's death finally came on June 26, 1830, it was not met with sorrow, but with a widespread sense of relief. The reign that should have been remembered for its grandeur and stability was instead marked by excess, humiliation, and decay. The king's health was completely destroyed. His extreme obesity, addiction to drugs and alcohol, and the devastating effects of his life of indulgence had destroyed his body and mind. The image of a monarch who had once been the pinnacle of English royalty was replaced by a human being so degraded and unrecognizable that he resembled a walking corpse more than a sovereign. His final day was as desolate as his life had been. Even with death drawing near, George IV refused to accept it. doing everything in his power to delay the inevitable end. His fear of death was so great that he refused to sleep, fearing he would not wake. But death, inevitable and cruel, finally reached him at 3:15 a.m. when his body, unable to support any more, finally ceased to function. His death was a melancholy end to a life of excesses and waste, and the public, who had already lost all respect for him, reacted with a mix of relief and indifference. However, the death of George IV was not just the end of his life, but the closure of an era of excess and shame for the British monarchy. His funeral reflected the state the kingdom had found itself in. The morbid details of his death, such as the need for a reinforced coffin to bear his colossal weight, became a public joke, while the courtesies and formalities of royalty indicated mourning. The true sentiment among the people and inside the palace was one of a burden finally lifted. The country, although moving toward a new beginning, was marked by the shame that George IV's reign had left behind. The legacy of George IV then was consumed by humiliation. His architectural feats, extravagant parties, and palaces built at the nation's expense were left behind, but in the end, what survived were the caricatures and the satire, the grotesque portraits of a fallen monarch. He was remembered not as a wise and respected king, but as a cautionary tale of how power, unchecked, can lead to total decay.